So you know the anatomy of the female reproductive system. Let's talk about what happens inside the uterus and the ovaries during the menstrual cycle. All right, so you remember that the oocytes, what'll grow up to be eggs, develop inside these structures called follicles, which are inside the ovary. These are multicellular structures, so lots and lots of cells surrounding the little oocyte. But first we have to get to that point. So the development of the oocytes inside the follicle and the development of the follicle actually starts before birth. It starts during fetal development. They start out as regular diploid cells, and then during embryonic or fetal development, they go through meiosis 1, or at least they start meiosis 1. They stop, or their development is arrested, at prophase 1 of meiosis. And they stop there until puberty. There are usually about 1.5 million of these primary oocytes inside the ovary at birth and until puberty. And they're not going to do anything else until puberty, and the woman is not going to make any more oocytes during her lifetime. There are a few odd cases, which is why there's that probably here. One of them has to do with a woman who, or a study of women who had ovarian cancer. So we think that ovarian cancer may cause abnormal development of cells, including oocytes. But otherwise, we believe, as far as we can tell, women make no more oocytes throughout their life. So we have this diploid cell, it starts doing meiosis, and then at puberty, about 20 follicles and the oocyte inside begin to grow. And as the follicle grows, the oocyte completes meiosis 1 and starts doing meiosis 2. That creates a second oocyte, which is haploid. That should have a nucleus in it. Sorry about that. And another cell called the polar body. So the mature follicle, you can see the follicle itself has grown a lot. All of these little dots here, these are all cells. Okay, and there is a fluid-filled space between the follicle and the oocyte. The oocyte is also surrounded by cells from the follicle. Okay. All right, so polar body. What's a polar body? It's essentially just a nucleus and a plasma membrane. All the other cytoplasm has stayed in the oocyte. The polar body does not finish meiosis, so it's just going to be reabsorbed by the ovary. The secondary oocyte is then going to finish meiosis, maybe. It is going to stay inside the follicle until the follicle is finished developing, and then it will be released from the mature follicle, and that process is called ovulation. The release of the oocyte from the follicle is ovulation. It's a secondary follicle, or a secondary oocyte at that point. It started meiosis 2, but it hasn't finished meiosis 2. So this is what it looks like. This is actually a microscope picture with a special camera inside, outside the ovary. Here's the oocyte, and you can see here's the ovary, and all of this stuff out here, these are those other cells from the follicle that get released with the ovary. The fimbriae are then going to catch this. Ignore this corpus luteum. I'm supposed to delete that. The fimbriae are going to catch the oocyte and take it to the fallopian tube. Now, it's still not going to finish meiosis unless a sperm enters the plasma membrane of the secondary oocyte. At that point, it will finish meiosis 2 and become an actual mature egg and create a second polar body. That one as well, it's just a plasma membrane and a nucleus, and it will be reabsorbed by the ovary. this one then, if all goes well, will go on to become an embryo and then a fetus and then a baby. Okay, so after ovulation, all of these cells in the follicle stay in the ovary and they become this structure called a corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is going to release hormones, and in a minute we'll talk about what those hormones are. It's going to stick around, release those hormones, and if the egg is fertilized, then the corpus luteum stays around for about 3 months until the fetus and the placenta and the amniotic sac and all that is developed and can start making its own hormones. Now, if the egg is not fertilized, then the corpus luteum degrades and gets reabsorbed by the ovary. And it turns white. It's called a corpus albicans, which means a white body. And it's at that point, it stops making hormones. It just gets reabsorbed by the ovary. So let's talk about the hormones. The process of making these hormones actually starts in the brain at a structure called the hypothalamus, which sends hormones to the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland, which is also in your brain, releases 2 hormones into the body, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. These were discovered in females, but they are known in males as well. So just FYI, males make follicle stimulating hormone. They just don't have follicles. The follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone levels change through the menstrual cycle. The follicle stimulating hormone is going to stimulate the follicles. I know who to thunk. And then it's going to make this peak right at day 14. Luteinizing hormone gradually increases and then makes a really big peak at about day 13. Day 14 is the normal day for ovulation, assuming a regular period of 28 days. Now, I know that there are women who have 28-day cycles. That's lovely for them. Most women don't. 28 is the average cycle of a human female. Menstruation starts on day 0, lasts on average 3 to 7 days, 5 on average. Ovulation happens on day 14, again on average, and the cycle goes until day 28 and then starts again with menstruation on day 1. Day 0 is the beginning of the cycle. Day 1 is the beginning of menstruation. Day 1 is the beginning of the cycle. So just keep in mind, yes, this is all based on a 28-day cycle, which is the average cycle. Many women do not have 28-day cycles. They might have regularly shorter cycles or regularly longer cycles, or they might be very irregular. Their period might be 25 days one month and 35 days the next month. It's really hard to tell, and that's why women need to track their periods and keep track of whether they are regular or not. All right, so the luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone levels are shown up here. Remember, these are released by the pituitary gland in the brain. Those are going to cause changes in the inside the ovary itself. And as we can see, the growing follicle, the follicle stimulating hormone, causes the follicle to grow. And then that peak is what causes ovulation. And then after that peak, the levels of both of those hormones decrease. That causes the corpus luteum to appear. Now, there's other hormones happening as well. Remember that the ovaries themselves produce hormones. So as the follicles are growing, the follicles start making estrogen. And as luteinizing hormone peaks, estrogen also peaks. So the peak in estrogen actually causes the surge in luteinizing hormone. This one happens like a day or so earlier. Then after ovulation, the levels of another hormone, progesterone, start to rise. And as the corpus luteum is forming, the levels of progesterone are rising. Now, if fertilization doesn't happen, then the levels of both progesterone and estrogen fall. Both of these together, progesterone and estrogen, as they increase, they stimulate the thickening of the endometrial layer. So this is the corpus luteum produces progesterone as it's created. All right, so this then shows the thickness of the endometrium. So during ovulation, the levels of estrogen and progesterone are both low. Not during ovulation, during menstruation. So from day 1 of the cycle through, on average, day 5. You may be one of those women who has a 3-day period. That's lovely for you. Please keep that information to yourself. You may be one of those lucky women who has periods that are like 8 or 9 days. Congratulations. That sucks. But on average, the menstruation lasts 5 days. That's the shedding of this active layer of the endometrium. Then as luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone are released by the pituitary, the follicle starts producing estrogen. That estrogen spurs the thickening of the endometrial layer. Ovulation happens again on average at day 14. The endometrial layer continues to thicken until the levels of progesterone and estrogen fall, and then we have menstruation. If fertilization does happen, then the corpus luteum stays in the ovary and the levels of progesterone and estrogen stay high. Hopefully, the blastocyst, that ball of cells, implants, and they will stick around, keep making those, and then progesterone and estrogen will continue to be produced and support the developing pregnancy. Now, if fertilization doesn't happen, then the corpus luteum degrades into the corpus albicans and it doesn't produce hormones, and that's why the hormone levels drop off. That drop off signals menstruation. All right. So that's the whole menstrual cycle, from the hormones to the actual follicle, ovulation, corpus luteum, producing progesterone, and then the corpus albicans not producing estrogen, and that leads to menstruation. Now, here's a funny thing. If progesterone levels stay high, then that's a signal that the corpus albicans didn't get formed, that the corpus luteum is still there in the ovary. And that happens if fertilization happened. So if you trick the woman's body into having high levels of progesterone, the ovary interprets that as there being a corpus luteum producing that progesterone. And if the progesterone levels stay high, then the levels of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormones stay low. You don't get the development of another follicle. You don't need one. You have a successful fertilization. So if you give a woman progesterone, then you're telling her body that fertilization has happened and there is no need to develop another follicle. There's also no need to thicken the endometrial layer. And that's what the birth control pill does. So stick around for the next part of this where we talk about different forms of contraceptives, and I'm going to talk about how progesterone and estrogen are used in chemical contraceptives to end or to decrease periods and prevent the release of an egg. They actually prevent the release of an oocyte from the follicle. All right, so one more thing before we end this portion. A first menstrual cycle that a girl ever has is called menarche, and that's just the beginning. You've officially hit puberty. You are reproductively mature, although you are definitely not actually mature enough to have a baby or be a parent. But the body, this reproductive system, is now going, and menstrual cycles will then continue. Now, for many females, it takes several months before periods become regular. The end of menstrual cycles is called menopause. And that means that a woman has not had a menstrual period for 1 year, not because she was pregnant. Okay, if you're pregnant, you're not going to have a period, obviously, for the pregnancy. And a lot of women don't have regular periods or any periods while they're breastfeeding. So many women will go a year or more without menstrual cycles simply because they're pregnant. Menopause is an actual shutting down of the machinery. The estrogen levels begin to drop because the follicles stop developing, the ovaries start shutting down. Usually happens at age somewhere between 45 and 55, and it's preceded by this period called perimenopause, which is this process of the ovaries shutting down, estrogen levels dropping. Women have irregular periods, sometimes very heavy, sometimes very light, sometimes very long, sometimes very short. You never know. Lots of women will skip periods. You may not have a period for 7, 8, 9 months and then suddenly have a period or have 1 day of bleeding. It's so irregular. It also, because of the changes in hormones, comes with lovely side effects like hot flashes, super great. And this perimenopause can last for several years. Then finally, you get to the point where you have gone a full year without a menstrual cycle and you are in menopause, and then you cannot get pregnant anymore. But until that time, you can get pregnant. In fact, I have a friend who got pregnant at age 46 while she thought she was going into menopause. Ha ha ha, funny joke. Anyway, so that is the female menstrual cycle in the human female. Stay tuned for contraception and sexually transmitted diseases.